The past hypothesis in the calculus avoids that. And it avoids that in really the way that's, in a way you think about it, the only possible way. Because if we were to stop anything short of the beginning of the universe, making this lower entropy hypothesis, we would be faced with this problem about making inferences to earlier times, what we think of as earlier times. Okay, so the very existence of the temporal symmetry of records involves this past hypothesis. That's sort of amazing fact. Our world is a world which is full of records of things. Stars are records of the way they were before because there's an evolution, a regular evolution of stars. But that's macro. There are microstates that realize the stars in which they don't evolve in the normal way. We got to get rid of them. The metaculus gets rid of them. Okay. So the metaculus really plays the central role in there being records. And if you think about it, really giving a probability distribution over everything, and the probability distribution is going to be reasonable, and we think of records as being records because they are probabilistically related to things in the past in a reliable way. And if we think of the, we see that the metaculus got to underlie that because it gives the probabilities over everything. Okay, that's the part that's very hard to really believe. So I don't think anybody hearing it for the first time is going to believe it. Whether hearing it for the 50th time will make you believe it or not, well, I know some people are still resistant. Okay, but that's the key connection with records. There's another key connection, and that is our world also has another interesting feature. Systems separate in our world in an interesting way, and our making of records or measurements involve the separation of a system that can be more or less considered isolated. It's not really isolated. But if you think about the copies of a book, each of those books are records of things earlier, or newspapers, which are more or less isolated from things around them, at least over a period of time, in such a way that the probability of what is said in those books being correct is, if it's a newspaper, maybe it's not such a high probability, but they're reliable indicators of things in the past, just on themselves, independently of the others. So they're sort of separate records. Of course, this will involve a lot of background macro state holding fixed also. So to really think this through is going to take some work. But I hope I've said enough to give you an indication of why it would be that there are records of the past, but on this probability distribution, there would be no records of the future, because we don't have anything like a future hypothesis constraining the future state. Yeah. So, maybe you were reading this, I hope, while I was talking. So, the metaculus underlies the possibility of records, and I think even does more than that. Given some other facts about our world, it predicts that there will be lots of records in our world, as there is. Of course, if it didn't do that, since we think it's very likely that there'll be records, then we would think it's got its probabilities wrong. And so we would think there's something wrong with the metaculus. So I'm presenting the metaculus in a Popperian fashion, even though I had some bad things to say about Popper earlier. I think it's the right way to present it. It's a hypothesis out there for other people to see if they can make objections to it. Okay. So the epistemological asymmetry of records, and if you think for a minute, I think records include our memories, and even our perceptions are records of how things were. And teensy a little while ago. Underlying them is this probability distribution. Now, there's an important point here. I'm not claiming that anybody actually looks around the macro state in a moment and says, oh, here's the macro state now. We can't even do that now because it takes a little while for the light to get to our eyes, and says, okay, what can I infer about the past or the future? I don't think anybody does that. I don't think anybody can do that. Maybe Laplace's demon-like thing to do that. So the point isn't that we do that. The point is rather that this is the physics that justifies what we do. That's the point. Okay, what about influence and control? I'm almost at the end of this. I think I'll push it at the beginning. Well, here's the basic idea. We know, just as part of common sense, that we have something like influence and control over some things in the future, not a lot. I mean, I have nothing to do with whether the moon's going to move. I might have something to do with, let's say, how Heather's going to move, so I have to push her a little bit, or call her, say, Heather, can you come and help me with this? But most people have no influence over it, probably not even that influence. But I have influence over some things, at least my own body, and you do too. So we have some influence, but it appears to us we have absolutely no influence over the past. You know the famous poem from the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, you know, the moving finger writes and having writ moves on. Not all your cleverness or wit can erase half a line of it, or something like that. I don't get it exactly right, but so that's what we think. Okay, you know, I'm going to take a little issue with that in a minute, but there's something obviously to that. Obviously. Well, here's the idea. What is influence anyway? Well, it's the fact that we somehow think that we have some sort of control over our decisions, over little states, little things in our brain. States our brain, not little things, but you know, I can control whether I want to think, oh, I think I'd like it if Heather was over there, or I'd like Mike to be over there, or something like that, or I'd like to raise my hand to go up. We think we have control over that. I think in order to even begin to think about the notion of influence, which if you think about it for a moment, realize it's a kind of counterfactual notion. It's what would be if something. We're going to have to introduce some sort of measure of closeness of ways things might be, closeness of the world, something like what Lewis does. Now, I don't think the way Lewis evaluates counterfactuals is at all right. Now, go, hold the paper. But I think the basic idea, and it's not just him, Goodman who introduced this idea, many other people, have this idea that we've got to look at somewhat similar situations. Let's just do it in this one place, what we might call direct control over ourselves. We can think of it as over our bodily movements or make it just in our brain. And then we might ask the question, well, what does the physics entail will happen about other control of other things? And suppose the physics is the mentaculus. And there's an interesting thing that will follow. And I'm just going to tell you what it is. What will follow is this. If we suppose, let me say, David Albert in his book introduces this control business as a myth. He calls it the myth of agency. I think it was a mistake to call it a myth. It's something that's needed even to think about the notion of influence, because we've got to have this sort of counterfactual business. So we've got to have some sort of something, alternative states, and an obvious place to begin with them is over our own decisions. Okay, so given that, what will follow from the physics? Well, here's the rough idea. Given this macro branching stuff, what will follow is that what we're doing when we're making imagining these different choices, what we're doing is really picking different micro trajectories for the whole world. Well, that will mean that, in fact, on this, if determinism is true, we will have a great deal of influence over the past, as well as the future, over the micro past. It's unavoidable. Lewis noticed this. Those of you who know David Lewis is a kind of counterfactual, so maybe everybody here. You know, he noticed this. He realized that, ooh, if he's going to introduce counterfactuals with little changes, I think he was actually thinking about little changes in the brain, although he doesn't say that explicitly. His examples fit that. He would have to introduce what he called little miracles, violations of law, to avoid getting influence way back to the past. Nevertheless, he still gets some. This is influence over the past. But this idea of violations of law, that's even worse. That somehow your control is going to make a difference to what the laws are. That's even, I think it's worse. But anyway, it's counterintuitive. But I think influence over the past is not bad. It's, if we're really convinced that determinism is true in the microphysics, and if we think that we want to evaluate what would happen if we made different decisions, we'll talk about whether we can make different decisions in a minute, then inevitably we're going to have influence over the micro past. But here's the big difference, that although we'll have influence over the micro past, we'll have no useful influence over the